I'm about to be observed by my boss. Should I teach like I always do, or should I try to plan the perfect lesson? We're going to talk you through the ins and outs of prepping for your upcoming evaluation.
Welcome to the DIESOL podcast, where we focus on developing innovation in English as a second or other language.
I'm Brent Warner, professor of ESL at Irvine Valley College, and I'm here with Ixchell Reyes, award-winning educator, specialist in professional development and teacher training with an Edtech focus. How are you, Ixchell?
I'm doing well. How are you, Brent?
I'm doing pretty good. So today we're talking about the dreaded observation.
I know. I mean, what are you talking about, dreaded? Don't you ever say, hey, I'm about to be observed this week.
Yeah,
so looking forward to it.
I think that's the thing too. Like, we want to kind of reassure people that even the best teachers out there, anyone you've talked to, they're like, oh, the observation's coming. And like, it's like you're supposed to be this rock star teacher and you're anxious about it, or you're worried about it too, right? And so everybody feels this way, right? And sometimes we're like ready for it, and we're like, okay, cool, I got this thing. Like every once in a while it'll be fine, like you'll be kind of in the mood for it. Most of the time I think all of us are kind of hoping to avoid, or would be not be disappointed if someone said, hey, you don't have to do an observation this year, right?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is that someone is going to be in your classroom observing, right? It's not like you're recording without someone, like an actual physical presence of someone there, and so it's a little bit more intrusive.
Yeah, for sure. So let's jump into the conversation. We'll get right to it, and we've got a few things we want to make sure that we talk through. So okay, Ixchell. So here's the deal, right? You're about to be observed. What do? Should you teach like you always do? I think this is the question I always have, right? It's like, should I teach like I always do, or should I like plan this quote unquote perfect lesson that's going to show all the things that I know and stuff it all into like one lesson somehow? What's your take on this?
Well, I don't know, somewhere in the course of my credential program, one of my mentor teachers at the time told us, remember, this is, if you're a new teacher, if you're about to start and you have that anxiety of the first year teacher or the second year teacher, it's not your time to shine yet. It's your time to just show that you can do what they expect you to do, and your time to shine will come later. And of course, as you grow into the teacher role, and as you get to know your school or your organization, and as you get to know yourself better as a teacher, you become a little bit more comfortable. And it's then when you can start thinking about maybe trying something new, maybe not all the things, because that would be overwhelming. And also that, that makes it so that there are more chances of something going awry or not the way that you want it to. And it could just derail your lesson. But I think trying something new is a good thing. I know it might just depend on where you are in your teaching career, but what are your thoughts? Because I know.
Yeah, I mean, I have both roles, of course. So I get observed, and I also do observations. Like, of course, as a full-time faculty, part of our responsibility is to go do observations of other teachers. So I'm on both sides of it. And I think the thing that I see, the thing that I worry about for myself is like trying to stuff in too much, right? For sure. Because it's like, hey, I want to show this and this and this. I want to show that I understand this, concept, and that I'm good at conveying it to the students or whatever else it is. I think the one thing is like really slow down and focus on what you can do. But the problem here, I think one other thing to think about is, how are you going to balance out your teacher talk time with your student talk time? Because in a typically good class, like, I want really heavy student talk time, right? But in an observation, we also need the
The teacher
observer to,
interaction,
yeah, the
right?
teacher interaction. And it's like, how are you explaining these concepts or whatever else it is? And I'm like, oh, I did this great 100% student talk time class today, right? And it's like, it was awesome, right? That's good pedagogy. And you're like, and then like the person's like, you didn't say anything the entire time. The students just went off and did their activity, right? And so it's like, so you do have to balance that out and figure out like, okay, am I going to throw in some just in time activities, right? Like I'm going to pre-plan them, but maybe kind of be like, okay, we're going to do a little side note here, you guys, this will just be 5 minutes. Or how can you balance out that time? Because the pedagogy says something like 80-20 is your ideal goal or
The
whatever.
magical 80-20, the ideal 80-20.
Right. And you feel that pressure as being observed
teacher,
as a language teacher, and you want your students to be talking and doing all these things more, but then you're also like, but right today is a different thing, right? It's kind of me being observed, and so I have to do some of my lecturing, or how am I interacting with the students, or whatever those things are. So I think they're all just things that we want to think through.
And it also depends on how much time you're going to be observed. I know in the past there have been maybe not in my current organization, but in other places where they come in just for 20 minutes. And can you imagine, for 20 minutes, you're at the mercy of whatever happens during those 20 minutes, whatever they get to observe you. But you're lucky if they're able to come in for the full hour, or full hour or full lesson. Like if you have a full lesson, that would be great.
And I'm also just going to say here quickly, because I think some people get frustrated and going, you didn't help me out with this particular. I personally would probably aim for like a 50 to 60% of teacher talking time in a lecture, in part of my lecture, like almost half of the lesson, I would say, like, or more. I would want to be able to show that I know these things. I think that's probably more than I would do in a normal class, or I would hope to do more in a normal class. Of course, some days we have full-on lecture classes too, right? Like, where it's just like, hey, I just have to talk you guys through these things. But I think that in an observation time, I want to get a good mix of right down the middle somewhere of like, hey, me talking about things, and hey, you guys doing things, and then also showing how you're going to interact with the students when they're doing things too. That's an important point.
And I think I think in your situation you have the luxury of being more flexible with the teacher talk time. Whereas in my organization, it's very heavily dependent upon the student talk time. And so that's always I think for me, it's always like, oh my gosh, I'm actually going to be speaking way more. So I have to think of what concepts I must pre-teach for us to actually observe closer to 80-20 talk time. And that might be scaffolding the lesson or concepts of the lesson ahead of time, which normally I wouldn't have time to do. But if it's an observation, I still have to meet the objectives of the observation, and I still want to get good scores, right? And I don't want to just be average. I want to, if I can, be above average. But yeah, I think there's also another point is that you might be overwhelmed, because ideally you would want you would have a mentor teacher that you could talk to about these situations and have them help you prep, or maybe just be there to listen to your lesson idea, or talk you through or you talk to them through your lesson. But many times it's your evaluator who's also the person giving you the feedback. And so we were talking about how that could be problematic, right?
Right. Yeah, so this is a little bit tricky, right? So when if your evaluator or it's your boss going in there and giving you your feedback, of course, and that's oftentimes what's going to happen, right? And it's like, this is the person holding it over me, so you get a little bit anxious about it because you have to feel like you have to perform, or put on your dog and pony show. But I also think it makes a difference too. There's a different part to this where it's like, I've been observed by teachers, quote unquote teachers, or people who used to be teachers, and have not been in the classroom for a long time, or I've been observed by teachers who I kindly would say I do not personally think are necessarily very good teachers, or maybe don't understand pedagogy or things like that. And so then I get worried on the other side of it. It's like, oh, am I going to have to explain the meta level pedagogy that I'm running through with
Mm-hmm.
these types of activities, because to someone who doesn't know these types of things, so let's say I'm doing, a station rotation type of activity, which is one, by the way, a little hint that I like to do during observations if
Mm-hmm.
I can. And they're like, well, you just had the students going out and talking to each other the whole time. And I'm like, oh, do I have
They
to
didn't
explain?
understand. Yeah.
Yeah, do I, and then you feel like a little bit weird because it's like you're
We
observing
have to
me, but I'm
justify.
telling you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like,
Yeah.
so there can be things like that that can be a
Mm-hmm.
little bit tricky.
And I've had the opposite, or not the opposite, but similar, where your observer may not be open to a particular pedagogical strategy, or they may not be familiar with it. And so, again, to explain, like, no, this is part of the SAMR model, or no, this is actually, research shows that blah, 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 blah. And you don't want to be, I mean, if that's tied to your salary or to your increase or to your contract extension, you're a little bit more nervous about that. That hasn't kept me from trying new things. Because at the end of the day, if you met the objective and you can justify how you met the objective, then then it becomes like, are you just controlling the method that I'm using? Because it's really about meeting the objective.
If you as the teacher know what you're doing, it's fine, right? Of course, and you can back it up, but yeah, I do agree with that. So okay, so then we've got a little bit of this idea of like over planning versus under preparing, right? So there's like the teachers who are like, I'm going to plan out every single detail and knock it down and make sure that I have everything going, versus I'm kind of used to it. I'm going to go by the seat of my pants.
Whatever happens.
Something will work out, right? And I'll admit, like, I've done some seat of my pants observations for myself in the past, because I like, this is what happens to me for observations. Sometimes for observations, but also like for presentations, is like, I'm like overthink it, and then at the last minute, I'm like, no, I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to do something totally different.
Yes, that happens to me too.
And it all goes in the garbage, and then I just end up doing something, right? And it's like, and I am experienced enough of a teacher that I'm not too worried about it, but I'm always like, is this a good idea? Should I really be doing this now? Because I spent so much time overthinking the process, and then I'm like, no, this like, and somehow I convinced myself that it's no good anymore. Right? So I don't know. What's your take on over prepping versus flying by the seat of your pants?
I think for sure, if you're newer to the teaching profession, you tend to overanalyze and be very critical of what you're going to do, how you're going to transition. And that's just because you're growing into the role. But I think I'm of the, I think I tend to lean toward better to overplan a little bit than to be underplanned, because you don't know what's going to happen in the classroom that day. And many things could go differently. But if you have an extra activity, or at least you'll have a strategy. And like you said, I'm similar to you, where I start with something and I think I'm going to do this and I'm going to try that. And then by the end of mulling over that for a couple of days, I throw it away and then there's something else. But then on the day of the lesson, it turns out that, oh my gosh, we finished a little early. The students were able to manage. Guess what? I have a strategy for one of the discarded ones. And so then I'm able to come up with something that's still relevant. Yeah. So I would say, I guess over time, you also learn to manage how much you spend on one of those observation preps, because you also don't want to use up all of that brain power, because you still have to teach after the observation. And so you can just be completely stressed out. And you'll learn to balance, I guess. I'm still learning.
For sure.
What are some things that maybe we definitely need to review before we do we have our observation? For me, whether it's your first evaluation or not your first evaluation, you've done several of them. I think one of the major important things is to be familiar with the rubric that your organization or your principal or your director is using. Also be familiar with the objectives, right? If you already know that in a previous observation there's an area of improvement or one that you would like to maybe showcase a little more, highlight it, and remind yourself, because it's so easy on the day of to just shift to whatever you're used to.
Yeah.
And so you're
Yeah.
more likely to make that or leave out what you wanted to improve. Maybe plan out in terms of timing. Timing is important, and plan out the segments and how you're going to transition into a different activity. Um, what could go wrong? A lot of things could go wrong.
Yeah. So I think I agree with you. Like all of these are
Mm-hmm.
things that you want to make sure you're at least planned out for. And so, but the biggest one that I think a lot of people skip is like, what am I being evaluated on? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like just being a good teacher. And it's like, well, yeah, but you know, like there are these specific things, right? Like, and it might say, for example, you know, your interactions with your students, right? And you're like, well,
Mm-hmm.
if you turned your entire lesson into just a top-down lecture because you wanted to show your ability to teach those skills like we were talking about before, then you're going to get lower marks or not applicable on some of your
Mm-hmm.
interaction with your students, right? So you want to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that you really know what, like you said, what your institution is actually observing you on, and
Mm-hmm.
plan your lesson around that. I think
And
that's the
then
biggest.
I want to maybe add one more thing, that when you, again, if you've been at the same institution for several years and you think, oh, it's the same rubric, nothing's changed, it's still very important to get to know that rubric,
Mm-hmm.
because it also, once you've planned according to the rubric, then it also gives you justification for how you met that goal, how you met
Right.
that objective, how you met that point. Because as an observer, because I also observe instructors and I've also been on that end, you have to rely on the fact that that observer is also taking good notes and giving examples of how you're meeting that. But if by chance they omitted something and you're able to say, no, look, I did this, and here's the objective that was met in this strategy, then you're also able to justify how you were able to do it. So the more familiar you are with it, the better, the more confidence you have in that you met that objective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Ixchell, let's talk about some of these common pitfalls. A
Mm-hmm.
few of these areas
Sure.
where you know, where people's make mistakes. So when you go into a lesson with your students, you know, do you tell? So did sometimes the teachers will have, I've seen teachers do this before, where it's like they're like, oh, we did this lesson last week, but now I'm being observed, so we're just going to do it
Let's do it
again,
again.
right? Now this is, I know for some people this is going to sound crazy, but it
Yeah,
does
it's
happen,
crazy. It
right?
does happen. To me, it's like, I understand. I understand why a teacher might approach it that way, but what a waste of student time. And
Mhm.
if I were the student, I would say, no, I don't want to come on that day. We're going to repeat the same thing. Why should I get up early to go do the same thing we already did if we did it well?
Yeah.
And I think it is important to let the students know that they'll be observed, but that
Mhm.
the teacher is being observed, right? And it's
Yeah.
important to let them know ahead of time that that's going to happen. I also think that someone who might be of that approach, it's self-insulting, right?
Mhm.
It's like saying, my teaching is not good enough that you can just watch me do a lesson without having to, um what's the word,
Prep
fabricate.
for it. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
I
So
don't know, it's like it
so it's
just seems fake.
well, yeah. So
Or
it's like
too
the
scripted.
yeah, it's the difference between a you know a comedy show and an impromptu, you know, like a
Yeah.
scripted comedy show versus an impromptu one. It's like, well, they both have, you know, you can see like, hey, the best of, I guess, right? But like the
Yeah.
truth is like teaching is impromptu, right? And so you need
Yeah.
to be able to show that you
That's
can think
it.
on your feet, right?
That's
Hmm.
exactly it. One of the things, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but it's the way you're thinking as the teacher who's being observed, how you're going to approach what that means for you being observed.
Yeah.
What else? What have you observed as a pitfall?
Technology fails. So I mean, like we have to talk about
me,
the tech.
me last week.
You had a tech fail in your observation last
Oh,
weve
I did. I sure did.
Okay. What happened?
So, so I didn't trust the computer I'm assigned, that I've been assigned to, like our classroom computer,
Hmm.
because usually something glitches, and I thought, nope, this is not going to happen to me, because I know I've prepared, I've over prepared, and so I brought in my computer. Except
Mm.
I forgot that you have to plug in an extra plug to get it to work as a touch screen, smart board. And
So you
in
did.
the rush of like trying to make sure, I forgot. So when I went to touch the screen, it did not work. So I was like, all right, it's okay. However, that was my tech fail, but I already knew that my lesson wasn't dependent on that.
Yeah.
So if that happened, I don't think anybody even noticed. I told my students at the end, guys, guess what happened to me? You didn't notice, but this happened. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd say for me, I'd say I've had those types of things before. So in
Mm-hmm.
observations, I do not try to bring in any outside tech. So I
Mm-hmm.
always, it's like whatever I have that I normally use, that's gonna be one. And then the second part, get there an hour early before your lesson, or how if you can get into the room beforehand or whatever, and make sure that whatever you're normally using is actually working, because
Yeah.
sometimes that
People
website can
borrow
be
things.
down, or
Mm-hmm.
people took something out of the room, or suddenly the projector bulb is burnt out, or whatever
Yeah.
else it is, right? And so make sure that you're really prepared for that. I think that's really
Yeah. I
important.
think with technology, one of the challenges I have is, or when I teach my teacher candidates, I tell them, look, because I have to observe them as well. Uh, have a plan A, and then have
Hmm.
your no tech plan just in case, because guess what? It might
Hmm.
happen. And so
Yeah.
I have that same approach. I always have a plan B, which is a low tech to no tech plan. And it
Hmm.
means it doesn't matter, because ultimately, if my teaching is what makes that lesson, then it doesn't matter whether I use technology or I don't use technology during my classroom observation, unless they have particularly asked me to um, showcase something I'm using with technology. Then that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah. And sometimes you could even, on your lesson plan that you're going to give to your
Mm-hmm.
to the observer, you could even have like you know alternatives
Oh
or
yeah,
no tech
absolutely.
versions
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. Put that in there.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and it could also be, for example, and I tell my trainees this: if anything happens during your lesson that is not according to what you had on your lesson plan, you simply pause and you say, normally we would have done this, but since it's not working, this is what we're going to do. And you sort of give that background explanation to the observer. And that saves you from, like, having to fumble and try things again. And then you get nervous and then you lose your rhythm. But
Oh,
it's, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. Oh no, all these things you're totally right. And I'm just thinking through all the as we're talking about it too. And one more
Mm-hmm.
thing that I've seen as a pitfall that we didn't add on here, but I want to add:
Mm-hmm.
have your lesson plan ready for the observer. I have observed many teachers.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, I don't have it. I'll give it to you later.
Mm-hmm.
And then they give it to me later, and it's like a kind of like a weirdly broken up paragraph
Mm-hmm.
with just like, here are the activities that we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not saying that you have to make a full on crazy lesson plan that's like
Mm-hmm.
perfectly detailed in the ways that we got into our grad schools or whatever, but although that doesn't hurt, right, to show that you really know what
Mm-hmm.
you're doing. You don't have to do that every time you do a class, right? But I would say, if you're showing that you're not prepared with like your plan for the class for the day, that is saying something to the person who's
Yeah.
observing you as well. Hmm.
And I think, depending on what the place requires, what your organization requires you to have on the day of the observation. I've had schools that ask you to fill out a form before you do that. I've had schools that ask you to have a full lesson plan with a copy of every single item for that
Hmm.
observer. I've had some who want it ahead of time. And if you're not sure, you could just simply ask, hey, do you require a lesson plan? Do you prefer one? I like to give, here's the material. I like to have anything that the students are going to be using aside from the textbook. I like to have a copy for whoever is observing me. And I train my teacher trainees to always have a copy of every single item, all stapled and ready to go. And so again, it just shows that you are thinking of also outside from the observer's perspective, which shows that you can manage. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then during this, you have a couple of opportunities as well here, right? So uh, how would you frame your lesson here? Like, how do you communicate what you're doing to your observer, Ixchell? I guess is what I'm getting to.
A lot of the times I talk to the class. I don't talk to the observer, of course, because they're supposed to be
Hmm.
like a fly on the wall. And I'll tell my students, all right, we've reviewed this yesterday. And so that, again, just the key phrase, we've reviewed this. That tells my observer that we've done it. I might say, now I want you to tell me, or let's go ahead and go to the board. And I want you to explain to me why this is important. I want you to tell me. So I ask a lot of why questions, because if I've taught the objective to my students and they're able to give it back to me in whatever format they give it back to me, then the person who's observing me knows that I've made them aware of that. And that might look different depending on the topic that I'm teaching. It might be a grammar lesson, or it might be a speaking concept with a language function, a target language function. But I like to do a lot of that. What I normally would have the observer, what I might explain to them later, I like it for it to come from the students. And so a lot of the times I also write on the board and I synthesize what they say, so that basically what is in my lesson plan, or what the objective I'm supposed to teach, ends up being written on the board somewhere, because that's also a cue for my observer to remember, like, look, this is what I'm actually doing. But a lot of it comes from the students, and I tend to frame it that way.
So I think the thing that maybe a lot of teachers don't see, they kind of just go into this, and it's like, you can really control kind of like this, like, you know,
it
mind
is
ninja stuff,
it's
right?
manipulation.
Where it's like, manipulation. But
you
can really,
is.
but you can control what people are paying attention to while you're doing, this observation. And so kind of how are you moving, right? It's like the magician, right? It's like, well, don't look at what's going on in my other hand, right? Look at what's going on in this hand. I want you to pay attention to what I'm doing here, right? And so you can do that. And I think that there's also a part of this too. So there's two parts, right? One is during the lesson, right? Hey, here's the things that I want you to be paying attention to that while we're going through all this. And then the second part is during your feedback. So when you're going to go have a feedback loop with your observer, sometimes they'll try to do it right on the spot, right? It's like, oh, class is over, let's talk about it right now. I personally prefer, and I probably myself would even ask, I say, hey, can I have a little time to reflect on this? Can we talk about it tomorrow, right? I don't want to wait a long time, but I want to get it done within, as short of a time period as possible, so that I can kind of think about it. I can kind of get some ideas inside of here, and then I can tell the person what I think, because one of the questions that the observer is always going to ask is, what did you think of your lesson? How did it go, right? So Ixchell, I know you have a good little mind trick here for this as well.
And this came from my graduate program, and it was on, oftentimes you might have an evaluator, like, let's say a principal that doesn't know you because they have 90 teachers they have to observe. And you really have to rely on the fact that they're going to take good notes, and that they're going to make the discernment between why you made the decisions you made during the lesson. But it could be that they didn't catch that and they didn't understand, and they're just going to assume. So a better strategy is to be ready with your reflection on what you did. So have some responses during your feedback session, whether that happens, unfortunately, right after the lesson or a few days after. But if you're guiding the observer in the areas that you want to focus on, rather than leaving it up to them, because maybe perhaps they didn't even catch anything and now they have to ding you on something, or they have to write something, right? If you let them know, no, I had originally planned to do this much, but this is what happened instead. And this is why I think it still worked. Right. Or this is what didn't get done today, perhaps, but that's not a weakness. That means that students needed more time. So I, as a teacher, decided to give them more time so that I don't have to reteach tomorrow. And so you're giving them the strategies that you used to differentiate, to manage the group, or again, like you said, we're making so many of these decisions on the fly as teaching is happening, right? Yeah. But if you guide them to focus on that, then that gives them also a way to write something back, and they might have feedback for that. or
And
stress.
you mentioned this briefly before too, but
Mm-hmm.
the idea that if this is your multiple times being reviewed, right? Whatever you got your feedback on, like needs improvement or
Mm-hmm.
grow in this area, right? Make sure you talk specifically about how you
Yeah,
did that this time around, right? Because then it can kind of show that you're paying attention to these things, right?
absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And so I had in the past, I was like, okay, needs to improve board work, right? Like my board
Mm-hmm.
work wasn't as clear as it needed to be or as clean as it needed to be, or I was underdoing it or whatever it was. And I said, okay, so this time I really built board work into that. And then I talked about it when I got the observation. I said, hey, last time when I was observed, we talked about the board work as an issue because those observers are looking at their previous ones and saying, did you catch up
Mm-hmm.
with those things?
Yeah,
And so then I said, hey, I did through this and I was working on figuring out the board work. I still don't think I'm as best as I could be, but I'm doing a lot better and I'm still continuing to kind of build that skill set as I go.
absolutely. Absolutely. Plus, it shows that you value what you're doing,
Yeah, for sure.
right?
And that's really what the real
Mm-hmm.
goal is, right? We're not going to have a lot of time to talk about this, but the real goal should be how do I use this as an opportunity to make myself a better teacher, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
we feel pressured because it's like, oh, well, this is going to be, am I good enough to keep my job, right? And so it just feels like it's about holding up, right? Keeping your head above water. But if we can switch that mentality around a little bit and say, hey, I want to switch it into how am I actually using this to grow and become a better teacher? That is a really powerful shift and something that can help you out a lot.
All right, so it is time for our fun finds. And this time I have a place in San Antonio. So if you're in San
Oh,
Antonio, this place is called Chicken and Pickle. And I think you've probably noticed that pickleball is it's a trend right now. Or
yeah,
has been a
yeah,
trend? Is it a trend? I don't know.
yeah.
I never heard of pickleball before, but I keep
Oh no,
seeing like
it's been
pickleball.
going big for a few years. Yeah, since
Really?
COVID time. Yeah, it grew
Well,
really popular during COVID, I think.
okay. Well, that's fairly recent. So
Yeah.
anyway, there's this place in San Antonio where you go and it's kind of like a family type diner. They have a lot of chicken items, but they're organic and they're very healthy. But they also have pickleball courts and they have cornhole
good,
tournaments.
good old cornhole tournaments.
Yeah,
Got to have
cornhole
them.
tournaments. I never even heard of cornhole till I came to San Antonio. But yeah, but
Michelle has
it's a
never
lot of
been
fun.
outside
No,
in her
I've never
life.
been. I live under a rock.
So chicken and pickle.
Chicken and pickle.
That's fun to say too. So, so mine is it's an account. I actually found this on I think on Instagram, but I think it's on multiple things. It's called Text to Song, and they basically have these text messages between people. They're kind of like these kind of ridiculous text messages, but then they turn it into a song and then they sing through it and then they play
Oh,
the text. It's a lot of fun. So so anyways, if
is it an
you're just
account?
yeah, it's an account.
Okay.
There's one on YouTube. I'll put the link to it, and you can kind of watch some of these videos. But it's just, it just gave me some real laugh out louds, and sometimes you
Mhm.
just need some actual laughing. And so, so they're put to like clever, like kind of fun, like power ballads and like
Yeah.
these, fights between a mom and a daughter on text messages or just different things like that. They're just funny. But
We could all use
anyway,
a laugh.
yeah, we can all use a laugh. So text to song, it's out there on the internet.
All right. For the show notes and other episodes, please check out diesel.org/104. That's for episode 104.
Oh, there we are. Also, make sure to sign up for the mailing list. I'm working on kind of reviving that, and so sharing out some things and having a little bit more of a regular process for it. So if you want to be on the mailing list, if you say, "Hey, sometimes I miss episodes and I didn't know that it was coming out or something," we'll make sure to send you reminders, but no junk mail. And I think we're only going to kind of do it maybe once a month to start. And so it'll be only from us, no junk, no anything else, and no selling of any information, of course, as we know what it's like to get all that stuff. So you can find me on the socials at Brent G. Warner.
And you can find me on the socials at Ixy_Pixie. That's IXY_PIXY.
And for our mystery language global phrase, we have
L'orthographe est la science des sots.
If you can figure out what that means, let us know, send us a message, and hopefully it's something useful to you. It's a bit of it's a fun one this time. So thanks so much for listening to the DIESOL podcast, everybody.
Thank you. We'll see you
See you
soon.
soon.